We had the largest group of gifts and cards.
We are officially on now.
Okay.
We will start in about 5 minutes for those who are still coming on.
That is one big honking carry around cart out there.
It's not too bad.
That is a commercial size for Nebraska.
What are you talking about?
That's
so
roll
nice.
around cart out in the hallway.
We have several of those.
It is a big brute.
We have them for, you ought to see it when we have a fellowship meal.
That's the big thing, is they'll stick like
They'll have carts out there.
12 crock pots in there.
Yeah.
The thing I dislike about glasses
Unless they get nasty.
is that they're always dusty. Always dirty somehow.
So good day here yesterday.
Yes. Kyle did his lesson on baggage was on hypocrisy. And it was very good. And then last night was Revelation of what were the trumpets signified.
I never heard it presented like that in videos, saying how, it kind of corresponded to Egypt and all that stuff.
Yeah, oh yeah, that chapter that of Revelation 8, he showed that the different, there were like 6 or 7 trumpets, and each one could correlate to Egypt.
The plagues.
Oh, yeah.
The plagues.
So then he said that first century would have kind of known
Yeah.
what that was.
We were at New Hope Road Church yesterday.
At where?
New Hope Road in the Cube.
I worked with a lady she was one of my assistants one year from New Hope. I want to find somebody to be my assistant at Polishing the Pulpit this year, because last year I used Colt's wife, and she was great. I mean, she'd be again, except they're having a baby that month.
Well, that's no excuse. My goodness.
What was she thinking? She had never done anything like that and loved it. So.
Where are we starting at?
We are in chapter 34 tonight, but we're going to start with a little bit of a brief review.
Since we had a week off.
Since we had a week off, just kind of get our heads back in Jeremiah. But it'll be a very brief review, because I'm only going to go back as far as chapter 30.
Just a couple of minutes and.
Not going to review 33 chapters.
I've always loved it when preachers have said they'll give you a brief review of their sermon.
And 2 hours later.
It's like, yeah, the whole sermon comes later.
Got some guy in the window falling asleep.
Oh, yeah. Well, that may well have been what
Or they preached for 30 minutes and he said, now get past my introduction.
Yeah.
The worst thing about the meeting
Is this coffee, Mike?
It's coffee.
we went to a meeting and this preacher got up and he preached an hour. And he said, well, that finishes up our lesson from last night and our lesson from tonight.
I thought you were going to tell him about the funeral that had the preacher.
Any viewers out there, but
I have often wondered how many preachers it takes to bury some folks.
Well, this was.
We have had 3 or 4 funerals at Fayetteville since I've been there that had 3 or 4 or 5 preachers. They just, my goodness, how many preachers does it take to get somebody in the ground?
We moved to
All for the
South
family.
Florida,
Yeah.
and we thought, oh, he's gonna have all kind of funerals to do. This one, what, you had one,
We're in South Florida.
Lake Worth?
Okay.
The one funeral I had was a member of the church. He was a baby that died. The funeral home called me up. I had 80-year-old people in the congregation.
Right. One of our elders, when I moved to Fayetteville, worked for Delta. And in his peregrinations around the country with Delta, at one point they had been somewhere down in Florida. I want to say Tampa, maybe.
Would be.
Somewhere where there is a very, very large retiree population.
That could have been like.
And,
All of Florida.
he,
Was it Jewish retirement?
it was just old. But he went down there first for about 6 months and just lived in a little efficiency apartment. And then she followed him after they got the house sold and what have you. And they lived there about 6 months or a year. And she was miserable the whole time. I told him, "You've got to get me out." Well, they had new grandchildren and that weren't anywhere close to there. She didn't know anybody there, and the church was nice, but it was just not anything like home. She said, "Everywhere I go, I go to the mall, I go to the gym, I go to the cafe. The only thing I can smell is Bengay." She said, "You got to get me out of here."
Well, we said where we were 27 at the time.
You could start.
Okay. Time to begin, it says.
Newlyweds and newlyweds.
Yeah, I've been a couple of places like that. Well, let's go back and take a brief look at chapters 30, 31, 32, 33, just by way of kind of getting our heads back into Jeremiah since we've been off for a week. I know some of you have done some writing. I appreciate that. Let me point you to the assignment for this week. The assignment for this week, due next week, and a sermon outline from Jeremiah chapter 35. And you develop this as you please, the faithfulness of the Rechabites that Jeremiah talks about in Jeremiah chapter 35. Also this week, for those of you who are taking the class for credit, I will email you a copy, PDF or Word document, a copy of the midterm exam. This is my mistake. I meant to pass that out and email that last time. It was in my notes and it completely slipped my mind to do it. It's a take-home test. It covers the first 33 chapters of the book. It's not terribly hard. Just get somebody in the church where you are to proctor it when you take it, and we'll be good with that. You can email it back to me, or you can bring it to class if you want to. So, good evening, Jeremiah chapter 30. Just by way of review, here we have the promise of restoration as Jeremiah is dealing with Judah primarily. Israel is mentioned in this context also, but there is the promise of restoration for Judah. They are enslaved, and in the process of being enslaved, Israel particularly has been, national Israel has been enslaved in Assyrian and now Babylonian bondage for well over 100 years. And the reason for their circumstances, the reason for Judah going into captivity, they're already dominated by the Babylonians, but the reason that they're going to be in complete captivity, of course, is their apostasy. They have turned away from God. They have been unfaithful. They have been inconsistent. The one dependable thing about Israel and then Judah has been what? What characteristic? They're undependable. You can count on them to be inconsistent, which is not a very good quality to be consistent in. So, at the end of chapter 30 then, from verses 18 down to 24, as Jeremiah is recounting what's going on with these people, thus says the Lord, I will restore the fortunes of the tents of Jacob and have compassion on his dwellings. The city shall be rebuilt on its mound, and the palace shall stand where it used to be. For Judah, for the remnants of Israel that will be joined with Judah after captivity, there will be a restoration. But the thing that they still are not coping with, the thing that they still are not acknowledging, is that they have to go through this period of correction, this period of punishment, to get to that desired restoration. So that brings us to chapter 31. And in chapter 31, you have the blessings of that restoration. Chapter 31 is an important section of the letter of the book of Jeremiah. because of the mention of the new covenant down in verses 31 to 34. But as we go through this, in the first few verses, at that time declares the Lord, I'll be the God of all the clans of Israel. They'll be my people. The people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness, he said. When Israel sought for rest, the Lord appeared to him from far away. In other words, there's going to be a restoration of their relationship, a restoration of harmony. What's the problem that Judah has with God right now? Judah is at odds with God, and it's not God's fault. It's Judah's fault. It's Judah's problems. They're the source of the tension and the friction because of their sin. After captivity, there's a new level of harmony, a new degree of harmony. And at that point, God is going to be able and willing, because they'll have served their sentence, so to speak, to give them consolation, to give them restoration. They're going to become a new creation, a new creature of sorts. They're going to have new conditions. Of course, their new conditions with God are not going to be what some of them would hope for. Judah is going to be effectively an impoverished nation from this point on. They're looking for a Messiah. And the farther they go, the more they look. Remember that at the same time that Jeremiah is warning them, you're going into captivity. You're not going to escape this. You're not going to shorten this or forestall this. At the same time he's doing that, what's Daniel prophesying over in the palaces of Babylon? He's not just prophesying God is using Nebuchadnezzar as his tool. He's also foretelling in the latter chapters of Daniel the coming of the Messiah. And in those latter chapters of Daniel, what does he do? He gives a chronological roadmap of sorts. The 70 weeks of Daniel telling the people of Israel, of Judah, you need to be looking at this point, what's God going to do? After all of these things have taken place, after this much time has passed, during this period, God's going to be establishing the unshakable kingdom. We come down to the first century, and what are the Jews doing? You get to Acts chapter 2. We find the day of Pentecost, 3,000 submissive, obedient, receptive to the gospel, probably 30,000 that rejected the same day. But nevertheless, you have what seems to us a huge group of people ready to embrace the gospel. Well, why were they ready? They've had the preaching of John as a warm-up for Jesus, for the gospel. But more than that, their scholars, their professional students, their spiritual leaders, the ones who were not corrupted like the rulers of the Jews, those who were still serious about spiritual things have been focused on what? The Old Testament scriptures. And they've been looking at things like the prophecies of Daniel and Ezekiel. They've been reading the signs, so to speak. They know that it's time, that it's in this time frame that Messiah has been forecast to come. So they're already looking. What do the New Testament writers tell us about the time frame of Jesus? There were many false messiahs during that period. Now, what kind of Messiah were the rulers of the Jews looking for? They wanted a man on a horse. They wanted a political leader. They wanted a revolutionary so that they could have their restoration of David's earthly kingdom. Well, that wasn't ever what God had in mind, but that was their frame of reference. That was also why they weren't very receptive to Jesus when he appeared. He wasn't the Messiah they were looking for. But we come over here, and so God, through Jeremiah, says there will be new conditions after captivity. You come down in chapter 31 to verses 31 to 34, and now you have the prophecy of a new covenant. And the significance of that is the contrast between that promised new covenant and the old covenant that God had given through Moses. The new covenant is a heart-written covenant. The old covenant was what? It was a stone-written covenant. It was a covenant into which people were born by happy accident, you might say. But this new covenant coming is of an entirely different character. Notice what he says. They won't have to teach, verse 34, every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord. Why not? They shall know me. That there won't be anybody in that new covenant that doesn't know God, because if you don't know God, you're not in that new covenant. You have to know God to be in that new covenant. You have to learn. You have to come to the Father in order to be added by him to that family. Under Judaism, under Moses' law, you might be born into that covenant by the happy accident of physical birth, but you still had to learn what you were already obligated to. Here, you have to learn in order to come into that covenant. So you have the new covenant, a new commitment, and the new city then in the rest of chapter 31. Chapter 32 concentrates on confidence in restoration, the fact that they are going to be restored. Here is something that Ezekiel particularly dealt with among the captives. Now remember, Daniel goes into captivity about the year 606 with the nobles, the children of the royal house. Daniel goes into captivity at the beginning of the 70-year time frame. And he is educated in the Babylonian system in order to become a Babylonian bureaucrat to serve the empire. About 9 years later, Ezekiel goes into captivity about 597 BC with the second wave of exiles, folks who were uprooted forcibly, but sent into Babylon not as fodder for the slave markets, but basically as displaced persons, as colonists. They're the folks that are told, settle down, buy a house, buy a farm, have a family, get married, have a family, raise some grandkids. You're going to be here a while. They're effectively the middle class, the trade class from Judah. During the 11 years then, between 597 and 586, when the final deportations take place, when the rebellion flares into open warfare and Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city and finally destroys it, during that time, Ezekiel is prophesying among the captives by the Kibar Canal, down among the common folk of the Jews. And what is his message? He has two parts to his message. Up to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, his message is really pretty simple. It's 3 words: Jerusalem must fall. And they're all saying, no, that can't possibly be right. God wouldn't do that. But he does. When he does in 586, the rest of the book of Ezekiel, the second half of the book of Ezekiel, the rest of Ezekiel's prophetic career is focused on consoling the captives, telling them, look, God does still love you. God does still have plans for you. God is going to restore you, just as I've been telling you all along. It's just not going to be any day now. It's going to be another 2 generations before you get to go home. God has plans for you. Well, here in chapter 32 of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is basically saying the same thing. God has plans for you. You're in a sorry state right now. Your present plight is pretty pathetic because of sin. But just to reinforce the point that I have confidence in the future, what does God have Jeremiah do? Look at verses 6 through 15 in chapter 32. Go out and buy a field. Jeremiah said, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, behold, Hanamel, the son of Shallum, your uncle, shall come to you, saying, buy my field that's in Anathoth, for the right of redemption is yours to buy it. Here is a part of the inheritance that traces all the way back to the days of General Joshua, when the land is being divided up. And Jeremiah is the nearest kinsman that has a right to redeem this piece of property from Hanamel. So what does he do? He goes, he buys it, he has the deed recorded at the local tax office, so to speak. And that's going to come up again a little later. But it's a gesture of faith in the future. Now, what's Jeremiah been prophesying all this time? God is coming in judgment on Judah. He's going to use Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to demolish Jerusalem. The temple is going to be destroyed. This magnificent structure that traces back to the days of Solomon, that was dedicated in extravagant splendor and represents the very dwelling place of God among his people. He's going to demolish that. But just to show you that I have faith in God's promises, and because God instructs me to do this, I'm going to redeem. I'm going to buy this piece of property. I'm going to have the title, the record recorded, so that in after times, the record will stand that this is my inheritance, and my family then can claim it once again. So you come down then into chapter 33, and in chapter 33, you have the promise of God that they will come back. Chapter 33, they will experience peace. It's not going to be a very peaceful time in the short term, but they will experience peace, and they will be a part of his covenant. Now, that brings us to chapter 34, which is where we need to begin for tonight. And if you're looking through the notes, that begins then on page 57. I'll tell you there's a typo in the notes regarding the picture of the well. It's not on page 57 like the notes say. I think it's on page 69. That's just a little minor thing there. But you'll find that when you come to it. Now, in chapters 34 through 39, we have two sections to cover tonight, from 34 to 39, and then from 40 down to 43. The important thing to recognize is that chapters 34 through 39 are not in chronological order. They don't appear in the order in which these events took place. Look at chapter 34, verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms of the earth under his dominion, and all the peoples were fighting against Jerusalem and all of its cities. Well, when would we logically assume that this is taking place? What year would we associate those events with? We've got three possible years. We know that he came in 606 and basically kidnapped the offspring of the royal families and the nobles. That's Daniel and his friends. We know that some of his servants came back in 597 and took Ezekiel and the middle class and the tradesmen and so forth and made colonists out of them. And we know that he came back and demolished the city in 586. Well, when would he bring the whole army and everybody under the sun, so to speak? This fits 586, doesn't it? This fits the time that he's got the city under siege. He's not just standing off out in the distance threatening. He's right there at the door, right there at the gates. So this would seem to be 586 BC. But look at chapter 35 and verse 1. In chapter 35, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. Oh, wait a minute. We just backed up a bunch of years, didn't we? We just backed up about 20 years. This would be probably 606, 605, 604, somewhere in that region. This is after Josiah has died, but this is long before Zedekiah has become king. And Zedekiah rules for the last 11 years of Judah's existence as an earthly kingdom. So these things don't appear in the text in chronological order. Why are they out of order chronologically? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I could speculate on that, but it really, their being out of order is immaterial to the points that are being made here. What point is being made in chapter 34? Chapter 34, the word of the Lord comes to him right then, and here's the message in verse 2. Go speak to Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and say, here's what the Lord has to say to you. And then, in a nutshell, what does the Lord have to say?
It's not, y'all are going to Babylon.
Not only are things coming upon you, but Zedekiah, king, you are going to die in Babylon. You're not even going to die here and be buried among your fathers. You're going to die in Babylon. You're not going to get to stay here. Now, in chapter 35, we back up probably 20 odd years. And what's the focus really of chapter 35? The faithfulness of these descendants of Rechab. And what message is God trying to get across to Judah? You haven't been faithful to me. You don't understand why I have a problem with you? Let me illustrate it for you. And that's what this really is a graphic illustration. You have not been faithful. That's what it's all about. So you come down to chapter 36 then. Now we are back in that time frame still. And Jeremiah has word from the Lord and sends it into the palace. Jeremiah is not welcome in the palace in Jehoiakim's reign, so he has to send Baruch, his secretary. The technical word there is amanuensis. It's just the fellow that wrote it down for him. And Baruch reads it. And what does Jehoiakim do? First, he reads it in the hearing of the nobles and the elders and so forth, and they bring that to the attention of the king, and he has it brought into the palace proper. It's wintertime, it's cold, there's a fire burning in a basket, a brazier there. Jehoiakim begins to read, having it read, and every few lines he'd take a knife and slice off part of it, throw it in the fire. Slice off some more of it, throw it in the fire. Slice off some more of it, throw it in the fire. He didn't like what Jeremiah prophesied, so he's just going to get rid of it. Come down to the end of the chapter. What do you find? Getting rid of God's word is not that easy. God is a little more persistent than that. But come to chapter 37 now, and where are we? Whoop. Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made king in the land of Judah, reigned instead of Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim. But neither he nor his servants nor the people had listened to the words of the Lord that spoke through the prophet Jeremiah. Okay, so now we're jump forward again in time. We have this little backdrop interlude, chapters 35 and 36, which really, if they're being out of sync chronologically, serves a purpose. The purpose it serves is to emphasize that the root of the stress and struggle in chapters 34 and 37 in the days of King Zedekiah, the root of it goes way back. It's not just him and his generation. The root of their problem with God goes back generations. Michael?
So in other words, 34 is in the moment, 35 and 36 is kind of like a flashback.
Yes.
Here's, like we're seeing on a TV show, we kind of go back in the cloud and see.
It sets it doesn't set the stage, but it explains the setting of chapter 34. You come to chapter 34, here's Zedekiah, it's in the moment. There's been a steady progression, more or less, up to this point. And then, as you say, it's kind of like a flashback that says, okay, here's how we got here. Here's how we got into this state. This is not an abrupt development. This is a thing that's been building a long time. What's the thing that Jeremiah struggles with emotionally, off and on, all through the book? Jeremiah he's not a mean person by temperament. He's not the kind of guy that could take these hard pronunciations of judgment and say, yeah, give it to him, Lord. He's the kind of guy that says, oh, isn't there something we can do about it? Can't we? Isn't there some way we can slow this down, mitigate this, dampen this down? He hurts for his people. So here we come in chapters 35 and 36. And it may well be that this is as much for Jeremiah's benefit as anybody else, where they're being reminded this is a long-standing problem. The cup of God's wrath is full, but he didn't just pour it full all at once. It's been slowly building all this time. He has spent generation after generation after generation sending prophets and sending messengers to them, urging them, pleading with them, cajoling them, turn back to me. And they've had their good moments. They had Hezekiah and they had Josiah. They had moments where things really looked up and got markedly better. The history, the history of Israel under Saul and David and Solomon was kind of a gentle arc with a few little dips along the way. Saul started well and didn't end so well, but the nation prospered. And David was kind of the high point in that arc. And then Solomon starts just right here on a level with the high point. But Solomon doesn't seem to end so well in his relationship with God. But then what happens after Solomon? The nation divides. You've got Rehoboam, the foolish child of Solomon, that's going to rule even more harshly than his father. And in establishing that precedent, what does he do? He drives away 10 of the 12 tribes. They've already been looking to Jeroboam, who had been a servant of Solomon at one point, but they've already been looking to him as a very capable man. Talked some sense into Rehoboam, basically. Well, if he's not going to be sensible, you lead us. And what promise had God made to Jeroboam? If you'll keep faith with me, I'll establish your lineage. I'll establish your house. But Jeroboam turns out to be a better politician than he is a follower of God. And so what's almost his first step as the de facto ruler of the 10 tribes? Well, let's set us up a golden calf at Dan and another one at Bethel and the other end of the country. Behold, Israel, your gods that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. It's too much trouble to go up the mountain to Jerusalem to worship. Just come here to Dan and to Bethel and worship here. Worship these idols. You want to be a priest? It doesn't matter what tribe you're from. Anybody can be a priest. So he establishes a precedent that for the northern kingdom of Israel is uniformly downhill. Every king is as bad as or worse than the one before him. There is no consistent lineage of kings. Constant turmoil, constant overthrow, constant rebellion, constant murder and assassination and so forth throughout their history until they go into Assyrian captivity under Sennacherib in 721 BC. With Judah in Jerusalem, we see a little bit different trajectory. They kind of do this. They ping pong back and forth between good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king, bad king, good king. But every time they go down, they seem to go down farther than they come up. Overall, their trajectory is downhill too, spiritually. And we come to the time of Jeremiah, and what are they doing? They're hitting the bottom. Spiritually, they're hitting the bottom. What's going on in Jerusalem in Zedekiah's reign? You've got the priests who have not just allowed, but have participated in idolatry, not just in the city of Jerusalem, but right there in the side of the temple, across the street, so to speak, in the courtyard, it seems. So they're down to their rock bottom at this point. How did they get here? It wasn't, don't lay it all on Zedekiah. Don't blame it all on this generation. You can't say, well, it's our ancestors that are responsible for it and we're just the innocent dupes in this. No, you've had a part in it too, and that's part of Jeremiah's message as well. But now the cup of God's wrath has reached the brim and it's about to overflow. So, in chapter, I have to lose my place mentally here. In chapter 37, we have Jeremiah presenting all of this accumulated information basically to Zedekiah Zedekiah has not set a good standard for rulership and righteousness. He's just kind of been content to be the bottom of the barrel or the end of the line, morally speaking. And what happens? In chapter 37, we have Jeremiah being arrested. For what? Come down to chapter 37 and notice in verse 11, I mentioned Jeremiah buying Hannimel's property, redeeming Hannimel's property earlier in chapter 32. In chapter 37, verse 11, when the Chaldean army, the Babylonians, had withdrawn from Jerusalem at the approach of Pharaoh's army. Now, what's going on here? On the world stage, you have the Babylonian Empire that has just risen on top of, on the rubble of the Assyrians. They have just basically taken over the Assyrian Empire and shot into the sky like a shooting star. They've come out of nowhere to become the dominant world power. They have been contesting, just like the Assyrians, they have been contesting for world dominance with the Egyptians. They've met at Lachish, or at Carchemish rather. They have met at Carchemish. They have vanquished the Egyptians, broken the Egyptian army's power, but the Egyptians are not going quietly. The Egyptians will always be a shadow of their former selves from this point on. But they're not going to just fade away. They keep making mischief, making trouble. And at this point, the Egyptians have marched out of Egypt. They have come back into the area, so to speak, and effectively distracted the Babylonians. So the Babylonians withdraw briefly from Jerusalem. And what do you see in verse 12? Jeremiah set out from Jerusalem to go to the land of Benjamin to receive his portion there among the people. He bought this field at Anathoth from his kinsman. He's got a little breathing space now. The city is no longer under siege in the moment. So now I'm going to go out and see what I bought. Maybe he's got some records to attend to on the local level. I don't know. But what happens? You get to verse 13. He gets at what's called the Benjamin Gate. A sentry there named Uriah, the son of Shelemiah, the son of Hananiah, grabs him up. And what's the accusation? You're deserting. You're a deserter. Now, from his perspective, this is a time of war. The enemy is in the field. You're not a soldier. You're not on a mission from the king. You have no business leaving. And so he's accused of falling away to the Chaldeans. You're running away to desert. Well, what does that tell you about the circumstances and the morale of the people at this point? Apparently desertion was already a problem, wasn't it? Apparently some of them were taking Jeremiah's instruction. What was the instruction Jeremiah had been giving concerning this situation? How can you lessen the suffering? Submit. Surrender. What can we do about this? We've got the army of Nebuchadnezzar at the gates. What should we do? What should we do? Surrender. Oh no, what should we do? What should we do? Surrender. But that's not what they want to hear. So now Jeremiah winds up being arrested, accused of desertion. And Jeremiah says, I'm not deserting. But he winds up being beaten, thrown in jail. Notice verse 15, it says the officials were enraged at Jeremiah. And they beat him, they jailed him.
They made a prison for him.
The house of Jonathan was turned into a prison. And then come down here to verse 16. When Jeremiah had come to one of the dungeon cells, the English Standard says, and remained there many days, King Zedekiah sent for him and received him. and questioned him secretly in his house. You need to underline or highlight Jeremiah 37 and verse 17. Because here the king asks, is there any word from the Lord? God got anything to say? And Jeremiah has an answer. Yes, but you aren't going to like it. Is there any word from the Lord? Yes, there's a message from God, but you're not going to like what he's got to say. Notice in verse 18, though, what wrong have I done to you or to your people that you've put me in prison? Now Jeremiah is talking to Zedekiah one-to-one. Where are your prophets who prophesied to you, saying the king of Babylon will not come against you in this land? Now hear, please, O my lord the king, let my humble plea come before you, and do not send me back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, lest I die there. Don't put me back in that dungeon. Is there any word from the Lord? Yes. It's not favorable to you. But please, don't send me back to that. I haven't done anything to you. I haven't spoken anything but what the Lord told me to. You chose your other prophets. Where are they? There may be an implication in that question that the other prophets were the ones who had deserted. Rats deserting a sinking ship. That's only speculation. I want to emphasize that. But at this point, what does the king do? He basically puts Jeremiah under house arrest. He does not send him back to the dungeon. He actually gives orders for him to be fed as long as there's bread available. And Jeremiah remains in the court of the guard. Yes, sir.
Just go back to this for a second.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm needing to go back and look at some things anyway. I was kind of overviewing at this point.
I just found it interesting in chapter 37, verses 5 through 10, that Judah looked at the oncoming Egyptian armies as a relief. Maybe they even thought of them as deliverers.
Well, who had been whispering in Zedekiah's ear, so to speak? The emissaries of Pharaoh. That Judah is looking to the Egyptian army as relief from the Babylonians. And of course, when the Babylonians withdraw to meet the Egyptians, pause here and think about this. Who's better equipped for war? Egypt? Horses, chariots, armor, ability to construct siege engines and weapons of war? Or Judah, which is basically supposed to be a peaceful kingdom in the first place? Obviously the Egyptians. So the Egyptians come up across the Sinai, across the desert. What are the Babylonians naturally going to do? They're going to turn to face the bigger threat, which gives Judah and Jerusalem some breathing room. Zedekiah and his court are naturally going to view this as relief, as assistance, because what's the Egyptian ambassador been doing on behalf of Pharaoh this whole time? He's been whispering in Zedekiah's ear. Oh, don't you worry about Nebuchadnezzar. Don't you trust in them. Don't you be afraid of them. You don't. I know you promised to pay them tribute, but if you'll send some of that our way, we'll help you stand up to them. They've been trying to foment trouble, not to benefit Judah, but to cause problems for the Babylonians all along. They've been trying to ally all of these little kingdoms against the Babylonian Empire. And that's what they'd also been doing, by the way, 100 years before, when it was the Assyrian Empire. Go ahead.
The thing that stood out to me reading those verses 9 and 10, thus says the Lord, do not deceive yourselves, saying the Chaldeans will surely go away from us, for they will not go. For even if you had defeated the entire army of Chaldeans who were fighting against you, and there were only wounded men left among them, each man in his tent, they would rise up and burn this city with fire.
Yeah.
So God, even if they were the weakest they could be, God would still use them.
There you go. God says, look, if I have to get the cripples and the malingerers out of the Babylonian army to do the job, they're going to do the job I sent them to do.
I think in looking too ahead to what's coming and reading ahead, Jeremiah asked not to go back to Jonathan, but I can't help but wonder if in the future he's gonna think maybe that wasn't so bad.
Well, you just look at chapter 38 and you kind of wonder, because what's happened in chapter 37? In chapter 37, he sets out to see the field that he bought. He's accused of desertion. He's beaten. He's imprisoned, seemingly not with any sustenance. He appears to be starving in the prison because Zedekiah specifically details food for him. He says, if I go back there, I'm going to die. So he's released by the king's order from that and basically put under house arrest in the court of the king. But come to chapter 38, and what happens in chapter 38?
That's when it gets put down.
Now it's going to get worse.
That's more
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because twice here in chapter 37, in verse 3, Zedekiah is sending somebody to Jeremiah saying, pray for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you noted in verse 17, he's secretly going to Jeremiah and saying, what does God have to say? I mean, what's going on in Zedekiah's mind?
Well, look at Zedekiah, and you see here a man who, he wants God's blessings. He wants God to be on his side. He's not so far removed from God that he doesn't recognize that there's benefit to God being on your side. And he says, pray for us. He's willing to accept God's blessings. What's he not willing to do? He's not willing to stand up with God.
Or in front of anybody.
In front of anybody. What's the scenario in his court? How did Zedekiah get to be king? Nebuchadnezzar put him on the throne. So Zedekiah is number whichever down the line of succession from Josiah.
He's afraid of losing his power.
He didn't get to be king on his own merits in the first place. He inherited his kingdom from his brothers. He saw his brother Jeconiah, Jehoiachin, reign for 3 months and be deposed. He saw his other brother, Jehoiakim, reign for several years. But how did he become king? He was put on the throne by the Egyptians and then deposed by the Babylonians. Before him was Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz lasted 3 months and was deposed. What does he know about his position in Jerusalem? He may be the king, but he's not really in charge. Who's in charge? You look at chapters 36 and 37. Who's in charge in Jerusalem? Basically, the bureaucrats. Who's in control are his advisors, his counselors. Who is it that he's afraid will learn that he is talking to Jeremiah? Look at chapter 37. Is there any word from the Lord? Verse 17. And then verses 18, 19, 20, Jeremiah is pleading, don't send me back there. But notice in verse 21, King Zedekiah gave orders. They committed Jeremiah to the court of the guard. Bread was appointed for him. Jeremiah remained in the court. But what's the backdrop of this? Verse 16. Jeremiah is in the dungeon, stayed there many days. Zedekiah sends for him and questions him secretly. Who's he hiding this from?
Those people, it reminded me of fiddle, just like our brain. Jesus, when,
Well, Nicodemus comes to him at night. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night.
because he doesn't want to be,
And he's a ruler of the Jews. He's a member of the council, seemingly. But what do we learn about him and Joseph of Arimathea later?
deny Jesus.
They provide the tomb, they tend to the body, but ultimately, if they're disciples, it's secretly for fear of retaliation.
Well, his subordinates, basically, all the people under him, were discouraged by Jeremiah. That's correct.
Yeah, Jeremiah.
But
Jeremiah is
Suppressing them.
their perspective is you never have anything good to say about us.
the other thing that where Jeremiah makes his question in verse 18, it's like, what have I done to you? I mean, you know.
Well, and if you asked the bureaucrats that, they'd have a list this long. And it all comes down to you're saying things we don't like.
Well, even more, they already said it, right, is that he was making the men who were, the last few that were fighting, they were losing hope. Because
he's telling them to surrender.
Yeah.
They're accusing him of being what? A traitor.
Yeah.
Well, come to chapter 38, and the bureaucrats want to kill him. They want to get rid of him. Shephatiah, the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, and Ukal, the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, the son of Malchiah, they hear what Jeremiah is saying. They hear his message. Thus saith the Lord, he that abideth in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, by pestilence, but he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live, and his life shall be to him spoil. That's the blessing God will give you, is you get to live. Well, that sounds like capitulation, doesn't it? Yeah.
What I'm not clear on is, since Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah to be king in Jerusalem, Judah, why is he so afraid of Nebuchadnezzar bringing some type of retribution or of harming him? Was there something that...
If Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah, and he did, why is Zedekiah scared of Nebuchadnezzar coming back? You have to go back to Kings and Chronicles, the end of 2 Kings, the end of 2 Chronicles, and look at the demolition of the kingdom to realize what's been going on behind the scenes. Not only have Pharaoh's emissaries been whispering in Zedekiah's ear, but Zedekiah has been emboldened through this 11 years that he's been on the throne to welch on his vow of fealty and loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, to slack off paying the tribute that Nebuchadnezzar had imposed on Judah, to try to play footsie over here with the Egyptians and take support and encouragement from them instead of Nebuchadnezzar. How did Zedekiah's reign begin? It began basically with him kissing Nebuchadnezzar's ring and promising to be a loyal, faithful vassal king. And what's he done?
He's divided his nation.
He's backed off on that. He's welched on that.
Well, and we know that he obviously is seeking some type of signs from Jeremiah, obviously, as we've discussed. And that, of course, is against what Nebuchadnezzar would like as well.
Right.
I knew that part, but... Okay.
Well, you think about it. What is... You get right down to it, and it's a sad commentary on such things, but what is Zedekiah?
Pawn.
He's not just a pawn. He's worse than a pawn. He's a politician. He's the guy who's always trying to play the ends against the middle. What is his whole objective in all of this? His whole objective is exactly one thing, and that's to stay on the throne of Judah in Jerusalem.
He was 21 years old when he began to run
Yeah, he was just a youngster, basically.
and didn't have a brain working.
Didn't have a brain working. You're probably right about that.
But he said he reigned for 11 years in Second Chronicles.
Yeah.
36.
Yeah, so he's just in his 30s at this point. He's still a young man. He may well be the baby brother, given his age at the time that he began to reign. That means he was just a little kid running around the palace when his brothers were on the throne.
It says in verse 10
Uh-huh.
and 36:10 that he was the brother, and the princess made his brother.
It appears that all four of the kings after Josiah were siblings,
Of Jehoram.
and
Yeah.
they were Josiah's sons.
Yeah.
Well, he must have had a passel of them over a fairly wide span of time.
It talks about Zedekiah here, that he
Mhm.
stiffened his neck and hardened his heart
Yeah.
against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel.
Yep. I want to have it both ways. Isn't that the definition of a politician? They'll promise anything to anybody.
Yeah, they'll talk out of both sides of their mouth.
That's right. Well, so we come to chapter 38. Here's Jeremiah saying, the only right thing you can do is surrender. By the way, pause here. You can make a sermon out of that. The only right thing you can do is surrender. When I have sinned, when I have gone astray, when I have offended God, what's the only right thing I can do? Surrender to His will and repent. When I have crossed my Father and done wrong, what's the only right thing I can do? Surrender to His will and accept the consequences of my sin. Are there consequences to sin even when I repent?
Yes.
Absolutely. Am I going to enjoy the consequences just because I've repented? Not necessarily. But the only right thing to do is to surrender. That's Jeremiah's message. And now the bureaucrats, verse 1, want to kill him. They don't like what he has to say. They don't appreciate it. That's what happens if the kingdom actually falls. These guys, some of these guys have probably survived since the days of Josiah. What happens if the kingdom actually falls? Mr. Counselor, you're going to have to get a real job as a slave in Babylon if you survive. If the sword and pestilence and famine doesn't get you, you're going to die a slave in Babylon. How many people in that situation are like the drowning man, willing to drown the rescuer in order to get one more breath of air? Here's God offering to rescue them. It's not a fun process, but they can survive. And rather than survive, what do? They'd rather drown and take everybody else down with them. Well, in verse 7, after they have rearrested Jeremiah, and now they've not put him in jail, but they've put him in a cistern full of mud. There's not drinkable water in it, but there is mud. In verse 7, an Ethiopian eunuch. Isn't there an element of irony here? An Ethiopian eunuch, Ebed-Melech, rescues him. We're going to meet another Ethiopian eunuch many years later, Acts chapter 8. And instead of rescuing somebody, he's going to be rescued by the gospel.
But there is that element that the Ethiopian eunuch believed in the one true God.
There you go.
It makes you wonder what was taken back.
Well, there is an element of commonality here between them, because this man did too. You get down later on, and what does Ebed-Melech receive from the Lord? Your life, your freedom is your spoil. It's your gift, basically. So Ebed-Melech rescues Jeremiah, verses 7 through 13. They pulled Jeremiah up with ropes, lifted him out of the cistern, and he stays in the court of the guard. He would have died had he stayed there. And now you have another interview with the king. Look at verse 14 in chapter 38. King Zedekiah sent for Jeremiah the prophet, received him at the third entrance of the temple of the Lord, and said to Jeremiah, I'll ask you a question. Hide nothing from me. If I tell you, are you not going to put me to death? Jeremiah says, if you ask me a question and I tell you the truth, you're not going to like what I say and you're going to have me killed. If I give you counsel, you won't listen to me. So look at verse 16. King Zedekiah swears an oath to Jeremiah. But notice the key word there, secretly. You look at chapter 38, in verse 16, King Zedekiah swore secretly to Jeremiah, as the Lord lives, who made our souls, I will not put you to death or deliver you into the hand of those men who seek your life. Two things there. How is it that this man that hedges his bets every way to Sunday is willing to swear by the Lord when he hasn't kept any oath so far, hardly? And notice what the king knows. He knows that there are people in his administration whom he can't control who are out to kill Jeremiah. What does that tell you about his hold on the throne?
He's a weak leader.
Boy, he's not just a weak leader. He's scared to death of his own shadow. Michael?
Let's back to verse 5. Zedekiah says, there's the others are saying we need to put Jeremiah to death. Zedekiah says, he's in your hands. The king can't do anything.
Yeah.
But to me, the key word in verse 16, he's swearing, I will not put you to death.
Yep.
I'm not going to get anybody else's way, but I won't do it. So you're right. It's kind of like
he is a puppet of everybody around him. He's the puppet of the person who's closest to him in the moment, it seems. He's scared to death of his own counselors, not to mention Nebuchadnezzar, much less Pharaoh if he should ever come around. Boy, isn't he a pristine example of what it is to be king?
Well, after they come and get Jeremiah and put him in the cistern, and somebody else comes and tells the king what they've done to him.
And what does he do?
He sends out people to get him out of the cistern and bring him back.
What's interesting about that event to me as well, is the fact that if you read this chronology of what happened, they actually in the inspired writing listed that they went below the palace and got some worn out clothes to pull Jeremiah out. What importance was that?
Well, now,
it doesn't seem to when I read that, I'm like, what there's got to be something culturally important about that.
Verse 13, they used to add his underarms.
Oh, right, but I mean, but why is that detail so important?
Well, it shows that this Ethiopian really cared about his resourceful. Jeremiah's well-being.
Question.
I have the answer. He's really.
It's just curious to me.
From a practical standpoint, back up to verse 6. They took Jeremiah, threw him in the cistern of Malchiah the king's son, which was in the court of the guard, letting Jeremiah down by ropes. There was no water in the cistern, only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. Okay?
I kept thinking about his feet in that mud.
Two keys there. Number one, they let him down by ropes. Have you ever been lowered down a rope or at the end of a rope? It cuts everywhere your weight drags on it. Even if you're not sliding down it, it's going to burn you, cut you, rub you raw.
Climbing the rope would be easy.
It's
Your hands up.
But it's far easier because at least your hands are typically tougher than any other part of your hide.
I think those elements go into it. He's in the mud.
Yeah.
Also, there's moisture there.
Yeah.
In the water. So his body is being shriveled.
Okay.
And so his skin is tender.
Yeah.
So you want something to help pad him from additional harm.
You're in the mud. Now, what happens to an animal if it gets into mud more than knee deep? It's going to get stuck. It's going to struggle. If the mud's very deep, a cow, a horse, livestock can actually get so mired in the mud that it can't get out. Well, how do you get it out then? You've actually got to lift it out so that it can get its feet on solid ground. Because until it does, all it's going to do is shift weight from one hoof to the next, to the next, to the next, from one side to the other, and it's just going to get deeper and deeper. Now, how deep was the mud in this cistern? I don't know. The implication seems to be that it was more than just ankle deep.
It said that a cistern, it gives a footnote, was usually dug out of rock, at a small opening, and then at the bottom, it spread out at the bottom, and so it was virtually impossible. So perhaps only notorious prisoners were put there.
Okay. It would be cone-shaped, basically, wider at the bottom than at the top, which makes perfect sense for a stone cistern, because what do you not want the water to do? You don't want the water to evaporate. If it's open at the top, you're going to deal with evaporation.
Well, also, if it was narrower at the top, animals could not.
Be much less likelihood of it being befouled by things falling into it and what have you.
Or drinking it.
That also means that there's no way to climb up out of it. You have to be lifted up. And as Lyle said, Jeremiah, if he's there very long, it's damp, it's cold, he's going to get shriveled up. What does your skin do when you stay in the bathtub too long?
It's shriveled.
You get pruning. You get all shriveled up. But more than that, what does your skin, what quality does your skin acquire when it absorbs all that moisture? It becomes very soft. It's very tender. Why do ladies moisturize all the time? They want to be soft.
Like when our boys were in band, they went through every year with the director how to protect their feet from moisture when they were marching.
Yeah.
What to do.
Yep, been there, done that.
So really, the answer to that question is basically the unit cared enough about
There you go.
Jeremiah to make him comfortable as they were.
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of making him comfortable by padding the ropes with old clothes, or if it's simply a matter of trying to do no further harm. I've having been at the end of a rope years ago, there's nothing comfortable about it.
Well, and he hasn't eaten, so he's gotten emaciated.
Yeah,
probably.
he's weak.
Well, I wonder actually about that. In verse 9, it says, they have thrown him into a cistern where he will starve to death when there is no longer any bread in the city.
Right.
So it almost seems to indicate they're still throwing him bread down in the cistern.
Well, it depends on the rendering of the text, though. The ESV says there, he'll die there of hunger, for there is no bread left in the city. And the American Standard in that same text, he's likely to die in the place where he is because of the famine, for there is no more bread in the city. There was no love lost toward Jeremiah in the first place for these guys that put him there.
It also says that the Ethiopian's name meant servant of the king.
Yes. Yes. Ebed-Melech, his name signifies his role. He is the servant of the king. Now, it's conceivable, I'm not saying it's the case, but it's conceivable that may actually be a description rather than a proper name.
Right.
That was not uncommon in those days. Well, Zedekiah swears an oath to him in verse 16. I won't put you to death. I won't deliver you to the hand of those men who seek you. But notice verse 19, if you will. You come on down through here. Jeremiah says to Zedekiah, here's what the Lord says. If you'll surrender, your life will be spared. The city will not be burned, and you and your house shall live. If you do not surrender, here's what's going to happen. This city will be given to the Chaldeans. They'll burn it, and you will not escape. Look at Zedekiah's statement, his admission in verse 19. I'm afraid of the Judeans. I'm afraid of the Jews who've already deserted to the Babylonians. I'm afraid that they'll hand me over to them and I'll be mistreated by my own people. Well, kind of late to worry about that. But Jeremiah is able to reassure him that won't happen if you will obey the voice of the Lord. Always this conditional promise, if you will obey the voice of the Lord. You don't obey, all bets are off, so to speak. It's 5 after 8 or 6 after 8. We need to take about a 10-minute break for everybody, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Was that an uh-huh or an uh-huh?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we'll take about 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes.
It's a bunch of cookies and
Start
brownies.
again in just a minute.
Cookies and brownies and everything, and we only eat those. I worked hard from those up here.
Did you make it?
I reached into the refrigerator and got them. They said eat me on the label, so I figured
He's
they'd
gonna
do
stay long at our house.
Michael, I noticed that you apparently don't believe what they're saying to you, though, because you're not munching on them.
He doesn't eat after
I'm
7.
just watching everybody, enjoying everybody.
He's got to keep his girls.
Yeah. I had one of those once upon a time.
I like my New King James Version. I like my ESV stuff. It does something.
Mine is not a study Bible, but I like my ESV because it reads, by and large, much as I have paraphrased King James and American Standard through the years.
Well, I like it because it gives you math throughout it.
But it's too big to read.
My Harper, I
It's too big to
really like
carry.
that Bible.
Yeah.
With all the references.
Your Harper.
My Harpers, I love my Harpers. I was sad to have it go away.
I may have a Harper's in the basement, but I've never been up that.
It was a Harper's Revised Standard.
Yeah. They don't, Harper's only came in King James and RSV, as I recall.
I had to have a
Had
Harper's.
some really good
real
commentaries and maths and things in it outlined. This Ryrie not bad, but
Well, with Ryrie, you constantly have to deal with their millennial take on everything.
There was something else
Say on the
that
label.
on it, but it was unidentifiable, so I thought.
That's like,
Well, then obviously you need
at,
one, or 2 or 10.
Thursday night of convention, we had fed the staff wellies and ice cream, and we bought too much ice cream.
That
I'm glad I didn't buy what was suggested.
the person,
So we had to make an
You
all
didn't
call
have
out,
that,
he
yeah.
like that night, it was theirs, and he was coming
Yeah.
out.
let me Google this, so.
And the kids got all excited about ice cream.
Ethiopian, yeah.
And then it talks about Zipporah, Moses' wife, was
Right.
also in that area, and had never really thought about her being from Africa. But
Well,
apparently she was.
among some of the Jewish scholarship, Zipporah is a Midianite, memory serves me, it's Jethro's daughter. And the Cushite wife is thought to be a second wife after she died.
Oh. I love it to that.
And there, well, I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Well, that may be.
That's the,
I was just looking on.
that's the Talmudic tradition, if
Zipporah,
memory serves me.
I've never heard her called that, but Zipporah
Yeah,
was a Midianite.
yeah. Because her father was a priest of God, actually.
Okay.
But
No, this is
Aaron
from
and-
Cushite definition and meaning Bible dictionary, which I'm not saying it's gospel or.
No.
no.
This says, Moses married a
Yes, they
Cushite
are.
woman,
Mm-hmm.
Numbers 12:1. From this circumstance, some will suppose that Zipporah was meant, and hence that Midian was Cush, whereas Cushi is elsewhere rendered Ethiopian. It is rendered Cushite in the Revised Version.
Interesting.
I don't know.
I'm not gonna try one to find out. Nice try.
Not necessarily-
I think you need to bring some of your caramel corn to class.
Ooh.
I can make some caramel corn.
You
I'm gonna
make
have to
good
make a whole
caramel
bunch for
popcorn.
Rebecca's party.
That's tempting.
So,
Yeah.
You know, the nicest thing that my friend Marcia was catered, and so when John graduated, if I would buy the food, she would cater the reception after the
That's
graduation.
really the most detail we get about Zedekiah,
And that was
more so
really
than Kings
nice.
of Chronicles. It really does show him to be just like.
Well,
we just love doing it.
But he
Marcia was a
vassal, not
fellow teacher,
only
so
a
I understood.
foreign ruler, he was a vassal.
And at that time, Ken
And then
was
it's
a
also this,
DJ for a
and again,
local
it's, we're gonna see this in
station.
Lamentations,
Country,
especially
and
in
he
the
was
last chapter,
perfect for that.
where he's basically saying, here's the way. But, you know, when you think about,
Evidently, his
the Egyptian
birthday
king comes in, and
hand
they
banging
take, so he appoints
sent the students
the
running.
king, and then we get to take.
Get up, hand on their birthday, say happy birthday, it's full of hand on their head.
Oh, that's funny, I like that.
The guy who had been appointing the other king.
He thought it was funny.
So,
I get tickled
It's really
with
sad
all the
to see.
things people think are cruel.
Do you think, that-
I wonder what that is.
yeah,
He told them how it would end.
Piece of gold off.
one thing we don't see much of that either, and everything we would think about it would be speculation for the most part, but, you know, the people
Well, I
in
get
that,
tickled,
yeah, poor Daniel.
not ha, 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 but the Korean
The
lady,
kids who were born in
Dress
Babylon,
very
we know that
nicely.
some stayed
I don't know
behind,
if you know.
this is a new life, this is their life.
yeah, very cultural. I mean,
Over 20
they
years,
have the nice pantsuits, the nice dresses.
deportations
You know,
ending with
Yeah,
basically
always
everybody that
so
had any
What is it?
conceivable monetary value to Babylonians being exported. And the only people being left behind,
Yeah,
affected was dregs of Jewish
Well,
people.
yes, the cake
How
company.
many people went into
Panama, not so much, unless it's, Sandblast Island, they have,
20-year period,
they're
possibly,
covering.
you know, conceivably
Mom's been
millions.
having back troubles.
well,
Back 70 years.
He worked
hard up my ass.
You know, in the days of Ezra Nehemiah and
Yes, it was 6
Zerubbabel,
pounds weight.
you can account
Instead of
for
being on a flat
maybe
surface, like a floor or table,
return
I got a weight bench.
Out of
already did a couple
all
on
the
the
12
weight
tribes.
bench, you know, the side exercises.
the vast majority, and all that time that they're in captivity,
And I, you know, take
salted out amongst
dumbbells,
the
and I
various
bring
colonies
them
of
lying down,
Babylonian
bring my arms
Empire.
over my head.
What are the
bouncing,
Jews doing?
trying to
Right
walk
up
out.
there.
Yeah,
you know,
it was fine Friday.
take a wife,
I could not move.
build a
I was
house,
just
plant a
immobile.
vineyard,
I had a lot of.
have a family.
Sunday,
You're gonna be
I
here
was
a while.
Walk into evening worship.
Grandpa, tell us about the temple. Well, it was wonderful, but it's gone.
Muscle relaxers.
Well, let's go. This is home.
Back into order on Saturday.
Well, they-
Most of them never
At
return.
Don't think drugs, you know.
You get down to the time of Jesus,
Of course, I'm out of my booth there.
where is the locus
And they have this foam pillow
of greatest
that
Jewish
they
scholarship?
have these, it's for
outside
balance
of,
now with
yeah,
Jerusalem
ankle to get
in the
it
first
stronger again. And I have to
Alexandria,
stand up on my tippy toes and that hurts.
You have
That hurts.
huge
I've done an exercise.
Jewish
I
communities,
tried to use an exercise called the Rebecca.
various
test.
parts of the Gentile world.
The guy blew it up, it's like 75 or 85.
You know, you've got way more Jews out in the Gentile world than you have in Jews.
I bought a smaller one.
Mhm.
And I also have.
Interesting in the grand scheme of things, because that opened up some doors.
Absolutely.
Later on. It might not have
But
been
they'll end up,
opened up
as soon as I can.
They have to
They'll have me
go.
getting on that and lifting one leg.
And think about it.
I see that we can't go over there, that he has to step on that ball and then coming back.
That's
and
what
forth.
they have you do when you Thursday.
Travels
You
with the gospel.
get on that balance cushion
in Christendom, you have some traditions about Peter and all the others.
Phone just sort of.
But we have no
That's the
inspired
Now
one.
you keep this table.
Where did the others go?
So that you have to say like.
You got these traditions that they went, hither and thither and yon and into Africa and as far as India and other places and so forth. My goodness, well, where would numerically the biggest concentration of Jews have been at that point?
Yes, there was.
After 500 years of having been planted in Babylon and Assyria, the biggest concentration
I don't know, but I know.
Iran, Iraq,
Balance.
what is, Pakistan, that area?
Yeah, she wasn't alone, right? Somebody was there.
Who were in North Africa and in Europe would have been migrants from there.
Walker against the wall.
We were the
Yeah, I don't.
enclave that was built for these.
Yeah, at Alexandria.
They had their own.
Had a replica of the temple and magnificent. Alexandria being a library city, basically, magnificent Jewish library there at one point.
That's one of the stories is I thought the Ark of the Covenant was there.
Yeah, well, how would you have an Indiana Jones movie if you didn't have a basis for that? By the way, you know where the Ark of the Covenant is now?
Well, according to Indiana Jones, in the U.S.
Oh, no. Remember the Russian gal in the last movie got it out of there. I don't remember now where it wound up, but
I think Elvis has it.
probably. Well, as Tommy Lee Jones told Will Smith in the Men in Black movie, Elvis is not dead. He's just gone home.
Yeah. He's working at Dunkin' Donuts.
Probably.
Well, actually, Elvis would be about 88 years old now. So.
He would.
Yeah, he was 42 when he died in 1977.
That's the year I moved to Florida.
Live fast and die
Bing
hard.
Crosby died too. Not Bing Crosby, at least as an entertainer, I like him.
Yeah.
I don't know as a person if he was that great, but as an entertainer.
Well, according to some of his children, he was not too great as a father, but.
I like him as an entertainer.
Well, as soon as we get Rich back, we'll start up again and finish the last of this little section here.
Rich has been going through, he had soldiers.
He had
Soldiers.
he had soldier.
Anyway, yeah, he had surgery on his shoulder.
Soldier surgery.
Surgery. And his PT has evidently been really rough. Mine has only gotten rough because they're doing balance on me.
Speaking of PT, my guy actually laughed. I told him about my abs, he just laughed, says, that tells you something about the condition of your abs, doesn't it?
Thanks a lot.
Those guys are not very sympathetic, are
No,
they?
they aren't.
They're not paid to be
I
sympathetic.
told him what I did. He said, that's what did it. And he said, that's telling you a little news about the condition of your abs. Hey,
Good person.
I can make myself look
Hey,
like
I just
Superman.
traded in my 6-pack for a keg. What can you say? Anyway.
I actually told somebody one time that it looked like a keg.
Well,
Won't say who it was.
Talk about being rude.
they used to describe a certain masculine physique as barrel chested.
I was thinking beer
Well,
belly.
You know what happens when the barrel chest shifts?
Spare tire.
You've got a barrel belly now. Anyhow,
Okay.
let's get back to the book of Jeremiah and happier thoughts here than fading youth. And in chapter 39 now, we have really what amounts to a confirmation of sorts, a confirmation of the prophet. But before we get there, I do want to point out one other thing at the end of chapter 38. Jeremiah and Zedekiah have had this back and forth, and Jeremiah has warned the king, here's what you need to do. You need to surrender. If you'll surrender, God will spare you. Look at verse 23. All your wives and your sons will be led out to the Chaldeans. You shall not escape from their hand, but you'll be seized by the king of Babylon. The city will be burned with fire. But notice in verse 24, Zedekiah says to Jeremiah, Don't tell anybody what you told me. Don't let anybody hear this. If the officials hear that I've spoken with you and come to you and say, tell us what you told the king, you just tell them, I pled for my life. Asked him not to send me back to the house of Jonathan. Well, that much was true. And sure enough, what happens? The bureaucrats come and they want to know. And so that's what Jeremiah told them. I pled for my life with the king. And they stopped speaking with him. The conversation had not been overheard. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the guard until the day that Jerusalem was taken. But we come to chapter 39. And in chapter 39, what happens? Jeremiah's legitimacy as a prophet is confirmed. Go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verses 18 through 20. What is the sure confirmation of a prophet? He foretells something and it comes to pass exactly as he said. What was the warning? If it doesn't happen exactly as he said, he's not speaking from God. He's speaking on his own nerve or authority. And don't you believe him and don't be afraid of him. And in fact, what was actually the penalty for being a false prophet? Death. Well, Jeremiah here in chapter 39 is confirmed in every way. Look at the beginning of this. In the ninth year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 11th year, in the 4th month, on the 9th day, a breach was made in the city. Then all the officials of the king of Babylon came and sat in the middle gate. What happened? The city's overthrown. It took months and months and months. But now these officials sitting in the middle gate, their presence there shows there's no fight left. There's no resistance left in the city. Now, in the rest of this chapter, you have the details of what's going on. Look at verse 4. Zedekiah and the soldiers that remain see that basically all hope is lost. And so what do? They try to bug out under cover of darkness. They try to head for the hills at night. But that's not going to work. What had Jeremiah prophesied? You're not going to get away. You're not going to escape. Now here he is, a politician to the very last, always trying to hedge his bets, always trying to work something out. He's going to try to get away, but that's not going to happen. Look at verse 5. The army of the Chaldeans pursued them, overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. Well, he made a pretty good run. He got clear to the plains of Jericho, a few miles away, but he got caught. And they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, and he passed sentence on him there. Notice verse 6. Here's the heartbreaking part of this. If you think about this, be sure your sins will find you out. What had been the promise from God through Jeremiah? Zedekiah, if you'll just surrender, what will happen? Your life will be spared. Now, Zedekiah's life is going to be spared, but your family will survive. Look at verse 6. Be sure your sins will find you out. The king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah at Riblah before his eyes. And then, what happened? In verse 7, he blinded Zedekiah. Not an uncommon occurrence in the ancient world, the idea being the last sight you ever see, the last image burned into your memory before you cease to see anything at all, is what? Your own children being slaughtered before you. The knowledge that your lineage, your seed line, your descendants are being exterminated. Your place in the history of the world is being erased from this point on.
Where was Riblah?
In Hamath?
Oh, I see. It is pretty up high in the mountain.
Yeah.
It also left
Nebuchadnezzar's up in the mountains where it's cool.
It's above the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
big
It also
time.
left him to be completely dependent on others. The very ones
Absolutely.
he feared, he had to be dependent on.
Yeah, he is left dependent on everybody else. So the rest of this, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, burned the palace, burned the king's house, broke down the walls. They just demolished Jerusalem.
Evidently, that was a pretty common practice, though, to poke out an opponent. Because you think back to Samson and his eyes are.
That was very common.
It's real common in war to gouge out the right eye of a warrior so that he no longer had depth perception and be affected by their enemies.
Yeah, that would effectively ruin a man as a soldier. Just take one eye.
I don't know why the right eye was picked. There was probably something significant about that.
Because 80-something percent of all people are right-handed.
Mhm.
And if you're right-handed, you're almost invariably right-footed. And if you are dominant right hand and foot, you're also what? Dominant right eye.
And so you can't shoot free throw.
And so, you take the right eye, even if you're right-handed. Now, as she says, you can't shoot free throws. You also can't shoot a bow. You can't sling a sling. You can't even throw straight at that point. So you're not even good throwing rocks. Unless you happen to be a lefty and they put out your right eye. Well, then you still have no depth perception, but at least everything is still coordinated.
Probably toss them a lot first, see what you have to
Might do.
You know, the significance of taking them in Jericho,
Mhm.
that's the first town they
There
come
you go.
to when they come over the Jordan River.
There you
because
go.
it's the land.
There is some irony in that, isn't there? Here he's captured in the plains of Jericho. And what had happened in the plains of Jericho? That was where, as the old song says, God had brought the walls tumbling down.
It's also where they took up the 12 stones.
Yeah. All of this promise.
Wasn't that also where, what's his name, hid the treasure under his tent? Wasn't that around Jericho? Achan?
Oh, Achan, yes, that was it. That was it at Ai, which is just that's just down the road, same general vicinity. Anyhow, here we are in chapter 39. Zedekiah is caught. Zedekiah is punished. Zedekiah, from this point on, is helpless. And now, look down here to verses 9 and 10. Nebuzaradan, the captain, the ruler of the guard, carries into exile to Babylon the rest of the people left in the city, those who had deserted to him and those who had remained. You've got those who have already surrendered. Maybe they've taken Jeremiah's advice, or maybe they've just seen that it was hopeless and given up. But then you've got those who have been captured, those who have been overcome. They all go into Babylon. And in verse 10, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left in the land of Judah some of the poor people who owned nothing and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. All right? You folks that are the dregs of society, the homeless, the crippled, the lame, the old folks, the people that aren't worth the cost of the freight in terms of what you bring on the slave block in Babylon, y'all can stay here. Have at the land. Well, what's going to happen? They're not going to inherit the land, really. As we go down through the succeeding chapters, we're going to find that they're scared to death to stay there. And along the way, what else is going to happen? Foreigners are going to be colonized into the land by the Babylonians. They're not going to just leave the land vacant. They're going to bring in other people conquered elsewhere and salt them into the land, which has some impact 500 years in the future in terms of the relations between the Jews and the Samaritans, Michael.
There's some more irony there, because as we studied the minor prophets over and over and over again, God was talking to the people about how they were abusing the poor people.
Yep.
They weren't being taken care of. So now all of a sudden they've got
they've got everything that had been taken away from them, and they'd been cheated out of and had been entitled to and hadn't had and whatnot. What can they do with it? Pick up at verse 11 in chapter 39, though. What has God promised Jeremiah all along? You stick with me, and I'll take care of you. Think about the price that Jeremiah had to pay for God to take care of him. He'd been faithful to God all these years, but it had not been easy. Really, at any point, even in Josiah's time, there had been opposition. It just didn't come from the throne. But 40 odd years, it's been a struggle. God has said, you stick with me and I'll take care of you. And now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave command concerning Jeremiah through Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, take him, look after him well, do him no harm, deal with him as he tells you. You do what he says. What do we know about Jeremiah and his relations with Ezekiel and Daniel and the captives in Babylon? The captives in Babylon knew who Jeremiah was. He had written to them and counseled them. You settle down and be good subjects, basically. This is the Lord's will. He communicated with Ezekiel and Daniel, it seems. At least they knew who each other was. Whose ear did Daniel have the whole time he was there? He had Nebuchadnezzar's ear. Nebuchadnezzar was a man who had great respect for Daniel. He's a little bit like Potiphar and like Pharaoh in Joseph's day, in that he may not be a believer in God, but he's not so stupid that he doesn't recognize that he's being blessed on account of a man who does honor God. Do you suppose, and I'm just saying it in a speculative format, but do you suppose that it was Daniel who informed Nebuchadnezzar of what Jeremiah was doing? Might well have been. Regardless, by the time they get to this point, Nebuchadnezzar knows exactly who Jeremiah is. He knows exactly what Jeremiah's done. By the way, it may well be that he simply knew because he had spies in Jerusalem. That would stand to reason in a military setting. But he knows exactly who Jeremiah is, exactly what he's done, and he is going to take care of Jeremiah. Well, that's the fulfillment of God's promise, God's prophecy. Whether the king knows that he's being used in that way or not, whatever he tells you to do, you do it, Nebuzaradan. And so Jeremiah's taken care of. Come down here to verse 14. They send out and take Jeremiah from the court of the guard. They hand him over to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, and basically he's sent home. Go live among the people. Ultimately, he's asked, what do you want to do? You can come and live in Babylon and I'll take care of you, or you can stay here. And he says, I'll stay here. We'll get to that in a minute. But notice also in verse 15, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah while he was shut up in the court of the guard. Go tell Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, this is what the Lord says. I'll fulfill my words for you against this city. I'm going to destroy this city, basically. It's going to be painful and agonizing and a lot of harm come, but I'll deliver you. I'll provide for you. You shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid. I'll save you. You shall not fall by the sword. Your life will be a prize of war because you put your trust in me. It pays to trust the Lord, doesn't it? It pays to take God at his word. So in chapter 40 now, we have Jeremiah in Judah. He receives, in a sense, preferential treatment. Verses 1 through 6, he's offered to go to Babylon. You can come to Babylon. I'll support you. I'll take care of you. You'll be safe. Or you can stay here. I release you to do as you please, basically, is what he's told. Verse 3, the Lord has brought it about, done as he said, because you sinned against the Lord and did not obey his voice. This thing's come upon you, that is to the nation. But I release you today from the chains on your hands. If you want to stay here, that's fine. If you want to go to Babylon, you're provided for. If you want to stay here, return to Gedaliah. The king of Babylon appointed him governor of the cities of Jerusalem, down here in verse 5. Or go wherever you think it right to go. Now, here are Jeremiah's people being marshaled in chains like livestock to be marched away to the auction block in Babylon. They are becoming human cattle in a way. Very offensive concept, but it's punishment for their sins. And Jeremiah is set free, presumably in their sight. They have absolutely no choice about where they're going or what's going to happen to them. And here's the captain of the guard, the general of the army, basically, saying, Jeremiah, you can go where you please. You go wherever seems good to you. You want to go take a vacation on the Riviera? Knock yourself out.
And that's really the candor that you read through is exactly that. It's like, oh, you can come with me, you can not come with me.
There you go.
You should go here. Well, if you want to go through the whole land, just do whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. You're at liberty to do what you get, the very thing that nobody else gets, Jeremiah. You can go wherever you want. You can do whatever you please. And so Jeremiah goes to Gedaliah's house. He's going to stay put. Well, you pick up then in chapter 40 at about verse 7. And in verses 9 and 10, verse 7, the captains of the forces are in the open country and they're ready to haul away everybody but the poorest of the people. So you get to verse 9, and Gedaliah has a plan. He's been appointed governor. And
So this is in Jerusalem?
It's in Judea. It's in the environs of Jerusalem, yes. It says in verse 8 they go to Gedaliah at Mizpah, which is not terribly far away. Yes, ma'am.
Go back to verse 3.
Yes, ma'am. Chapter 40, verse 3.
I'm in the ESV.
Yes, ma'am.
And it says, the Lord has brought it about and has done as he said, because you sinned against the Lord.
Yes.
That's referring to Zedekiah, right?
That's referring to Judah generally, I believe.
And did not obey his voice. And
Right.
now behold, I release you today from the chains of your hands. That's
Yes,
Jeremiah.
that's Jeremiah specifically.
Okay.
It may well be.
RSV actually puts in italics, you people.
Okay. The Revised Standard Version supplies the word people, meaning all of you folks. And it may well be, and I'm just speculating here, but you back up, look at verses 1 and 2. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan had let him go from Ramah, when he took him bound in chains along with all the captives of Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon. The captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said to him, the Lord your God pronounced this disaster against this place. Now, where is Jeremiah when these things are being said. He's still in chains with the captives. Whatever the captain says to him at this point, at the beginning of chapter 40, is right there when he's with everybody else. So it stands to reason, it fits contextually, that what the captain is saying in verse 3, the Lord has done this to all of you. He's speaking so that everybody can hear. But Jeremiah, you're being released. Can you say salt in their wounds? Vindication for Jeremiah? How many of them wished at that moment they believed him?
I think it's interesting also that at the beginning of Jeremiah, it does indicate that he is of the tribe of Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
So where he chooses to stay is apparently in that tribal area.
It's right in the general vicinity.
Since Jerusalem is in that area.
Right. Well, you look down here to verses 7 and following, all the remnants, the captains of all the forces in the open country and their men heard that the king of Babylon appointed Gedaliah as governor, committed to him men, women, and children of the poorest of the land who had not been taken into exile to Babylon. So what do? The remnants, whatever's left, they gather up to Gedaliah, and he's got a plan. What's his plan? Verse 9. We'll serve the Babylonians. We'll be submissive to the Chaldeans. Do not be afraid to serve the Chaldeans. Dwell in the land. Serve the king of Babylon, and he'll take care of you. It'll be well with you. As for me, I'll dwell at Mizpah. Well, why would he go to Jerusalem? He's governor. There's nothing left at Jerusalem. So he might as well stay at home in Mizpah. I'll live at Mizpah. I'll represent you before the Chaldeans who come to us. As for you, gather wine, summer fruits, oil, store them in your vessels, dwell in your cities that you've taken. In other words, you leftovers of the people, the little bits and pieces that are left, go about your life. Harvest what you can, gather up what you can. Think about this. How much of the land is left undevastated at this point? Not much. They're going to have to scramble and gather up whatever they can, because sooner or later, what's going to happen? Winter's coming.
Well, they're not going to be protected.
They're not going to have any protection. What? By the way, go back to Kings and Chronicles, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and read the record of the destruction of Jerusalem. What are the neighboring nations doing as Judah is being brought into captivity, as Jerusalem is about to fall?
Well, it says here that the Ammonites are sort of right there at the door.
You've got the Edomites and the Ammonites and the remnants of the Moabites, and basically you've got every other kind of ite around. And as Jews are trying to flee before Jerusalem falls, and then in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, as the mopping up operation, the capturing operation is going on, what are all of these peoples doing? The Jews are running away, and they're standing in the way, catching them and kicking them back to the Babylonians. Obadiah mentions that. They're picking off what they can. They see this as an opportunity to plunder what they can of Judah. And so Gedaliah's plan is, we're going to be model citizens of the Babylonian Empire. We're going to do what we can to survive. Well, come down to verse 11. Likewise, when all the Jews who were in Moab, among the Ammonites, and in Edom, and in other lands, heard that the king of Babylon left a remnant in Judah, appointed Gedaliah as governor, then they all returned. So you've got folks that were there that are able to come back. Notice what it says down here at the end of verse 12. They gathered wine and summer fruits in great abundance. Now, how do you gather in great abundance when the land has been occupied for months and months and months and months by a foraging army, and basically everything in sight has been demolished by that army?
poor left.
Do what now?
The poor were not taken into captivity, they were
Okay.
left to,
You've
till
got,
fields.
you've got the poor left there, but here's my question. How is there great abundance?
Joshua and Caleb said that the grapes were
Okay.
huge, they were prolific.
On one hand, as you point out, Joshua and Caleb called this a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a fertile, productive land.
It's part of that fertile crescent.
But on the other hand, yes, it's part of it's the tail end of the fertile crescent. But on the other hand, how are these people able to gather in great abundance when you've had a huge foraging army living off the land for months and months and months, when you've had them starving out the people in Jerusalem and these other cities? They're able to gather in great abundance because there are so few of them. The remnants of what's left in the land is more than enough. The remnants of the harvest is more than enough for the remnant of the people that are left there. That you kind of have an insight into how few people are actually left. They've gone from starving because the Babylonians have locked them up in the city during the siege to having abundance because, you know, a pound of sugar is a whole lot when there are only 3 of you instead of 50 of you. A side of beef goes a whole lot farther for a family of 5 than it does for a company of 100 soldiers. The remnants of a field or of a vineyard or whatnot, that's great when there are only a few of you to feed. So it says they gathered in great abundance, but isn't it just always the case? There's always a fly in the ointment. You come down here to verse 13 in chapter 40, and now we've got a problem. There's always somebody ready to make mischief. At verse 13, Johanan, the son of Kareah, all the captains of the forces that were in the field came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, and they've got bad news for him. A fellow named Baalis, the king of the children of Ammon, has sent Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, to assassinate you. There's a plot against your life, Gedaliah. Now, why would the Ammonite king want to murder the Babylonian appointed governor of what's left of Judah? Well, maybe he doesn't like the Babylonians. But more than that, who else does he not like? He doesn't like the Jews.
Yeah, it says
Who are the Ammonites?
verse 15.
The Ammonites, like the Moabites, are kinfolks of the Jews, just like the Ishmaelites are. Who are Ammon and Moab? They're Lot's descendants through his daughters. Incestuous relationship with the daughters. Lot is Abraham's nephew. These people have been a thorn in the side, an opposition, a counterweight, an objection, a problem for Israel and Judah as long as they have existed. And so the Ammonites, looking at the destruction of Judah, what do they see? Opportunity to plunder. We can take away what they took from us. Who did the Israelites go through in order to get to the promised land? Way back there in the days of Joshua. Who did they have to contend with? They had to deal with the Midianites and the Moabites and the Ammonites and all of these other people that were on the Transjordan side, on the eastern side of the Jordan, before they ever got into the promised land.
Are the Ammonites the ones that had the god Ashdod?
Are the Ammonites the folks that worship? No, Ashdod was a place.
Now the god, well, where their god falls
They
down.
spoke half in the language of
Uh-huh.
their fathers and half in the language of Ashdod. That's the half-breed kids. in the days of Nehemiah? I don't know. I don't remember.
I can't remember.
If not,
And Ishmael would have been back to Abraham.
yep.
The half son of Abraham.
Here's the point. It's a little bit like gold in my ear, talking about modern Israel, which is not biblical Israel, but it's a little bit like gold in my ear talking about their geopolitical situation. They're the only country in that whole area that seemingly is not sitting on a sea of oil, but they're surrounded entirely by enemies. These people are historic enemies of Israel. They have been through the generations. Some of them had been displaced so that Israel could get to the promised land. The remnants of others, like the Edomites, had been displaced from the promised land so that Israel could have it. But why were they displaced in the first place?
Which is why we have what we do today historically.
There you go. They're still fighting even today. Their descendants are. But they've been displaced because of their idolatry. These are not people who've never had a relationship with the Lord. They're people who had chosen to depart from that relationship or from the potential for it. But here, now there's an effort to assassinate the governor of Judah. Well, why? So that we can plunder what's left of it. So that we can go take back some of what we lost somewhere along the way. Because we've hated these people generations back before we can remember. Rich?
Well, I've got a footnote here that says basically forces that were in the field, they were Jewish guerrilla units that could not be captured. So they were going to be, mercenaries.
In a manner of speaking,
didn't
yes.
want Babylon to be stepping in on.
Well, now that may well be, but the people here are being bankrolled, shall we say, fomented by the Ammonites. And they're holding on to their illusions even in the face of defeat. I guess you could compare these guys in some respect, the folks that come to Gedaliah and warn him about this, you could compare them in some respects to the remnants of the Confederacy that were described in the aftermath of the Civil War as the bomb proofs. The folks that were just, that they could not accept that they'd been defeated, that somehow, somewhere, someday, things would reverse.
Well, just recently I read about somebody in Asia that had never surrendered from World War II.
Yeah.
That they referenced.
Well, way up into the 70s and 80s, they were still finding Japanese soldiers who had never gotten word of the surrender.
Right.
You look at the relationship between North and South Korea. That's the longest war in modern history because they've never had peace. They've quit shooting at each other for the most part, but they've been at war with each other for 70 years.
We're going to see this when we get to chapter 42 and 43, kind of along the same lines. Even after all they saw, there were still some who said, we're still not doing what you say.
Yeah.
We've seen the destruction, but we're still not going to do it. We're going to go to Egypt.
There you go.
So they still didn't get it.
There you go. They still don't get it. Some people seem to have stone between the ears. They just don't get it. Here in chapter 40, they bring word of an assassination plot. And what does Gedaliah say? I don't believe it. I just choose not to believe it. Well, Gedaliah may have been potentially a pretty good guy. But he was a naive guy. And so what happens to him? Chapter 41, in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah of Elishama of the royal family, a chief officer of the king, came with 10 men to Gedaliah at Mizpah, and they broke bread together. They ate there at Mizpah. Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men with him rose up and struck down Gedaliah. They murdered him. They came and had dinner with him, made nice with him seemingly, and then murdered him.
And this has a footnote that was like a sentence of death.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a unethical, doesn't even begin to touch the hem of the garment to describe that.
Well, and obviously, when Jonathan came to him, there was an issue with even Gedaliah doing anything because he offered to do it in secret so nobody would know.
Yeah.
So obviously, there's something going on there that you had to tiptoe.
You've got folks there that are just seemingly, no matter what, they're not going to cooperate with God, shall we say. It's the aftermath of a war. It's hard to put a better face on it than that, really.
But I guess if Gedaliah had, gone after Ishmael to kill him, then it would have started a civil war.
Well, one thing about it is that Gedaliah, at least in theory, had the weight of the Babylonian government behind him. He could have appealed to the Babylonians for help, for protection. Whether they'd have given it or not, who knows? But Gedaliah, for all of the potential he seems to have had, doesn't seem to have had much sense about his position and about how to handle his position. You get down here to chapter 41, verse 3, notice what else they do. These guys don't just kill Gedaliah, they also murdered all the Jews that were with him and the Babylonian soldiers who were there.
And some people from the field.
80 men from Shechem. Next verse. These guys are they're beyond the pale. They are not freedom fighters. They are not loyal to the king. It'd be hard to make the case even that they're mercenaries, really, except mercenary to themselves. They're just bloodthirsty now. They're just pouring out their hatred at this point. Notice in verses 4 and 5, the description: the day after the murder of Gedaliah, before anyone knew of it, 80 men arrived from Shechem and Shiloh and Samaria with their beards shaven, clothes torn, bodies gashed, bringing offerings and incense to present at the temple of the Lord. And what happens? They wind up being slaughtered too. They've already been humiliated, but now they're slaughtered, thrown into a cistern. Notice in verse 8, there were 10 men among them who had said, "Don't put us to death. We have stores of supplies out in the field." And he didn't murder them. They tried to buy their freedom.
Well, and those people, they weren't even aware of what had happened. They were led into the city to be killed. So it was, there wasn't anything to fear from these people.
This is just bloodlust on the part of the ones doing the killing. As we go through the balance of chapter 41 into chapter 42, you see all of this coming together. The cistern was dated back to the days of King Asa with the strife with Baasha, the king of Israel. This is an ancient source of conflict, a source of friction between them. But you get down here to verse 11. When Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the leaders of the forces with him heard what had happened, they go to fight against Ishmael and all the people whom he carried away. They turned around, came back, went to Johanan. But what happens? Ishmael escapes with 8 men, goes to the Ammonites, and ultimately we wind up with the people being afraid. What's happened here? These guys are not anything but terrorists. They're just pillaging the land. You look at verse 16, Johanan, all of his forces that he recovered, they go back from Gibeon, stay at Gereth Chimham, it's close to Bethlehem. And notice at the end of the statement here at verse 17, intending to go to Egypt. The record here telegraphs what's going to happen. It lets us know ahead of time. They've already set their plans, haven't they? We're going to Egypt. They're afraid of the Chaldeans. They're afraid of Ishmael. They're afraid of everything, basically, and with some reason. I mean, if you lived in this situation and everywhere around you, you've seen nothing in the last several years but death and destruction and violence and brutality, you've got to be a little bit jumpy too.
Well, this says that killing Gedaliah
Yeah.
was the equivalent to committing suicide. Because
Killing Gedaliah was the equivalent of committing suicide. Well,
that he had sort of.
There would be a sense in which that might be true, if only because in doing that, you're going to ultimately bring down the wrath of the Babylonians on you, because he's the Babylonian appointee, and to kill him is to strike out at the Babylonians. So that's going to bring the army down on you sooner or later.
I was just thinking what you said about them being afraid of everybody. They feared everybody but the one they should have feared.
There you go. They're scared of their own shadow, much less everybody else around them, but they're not scared of the one person that they ought to have been scared of all along. Reverend Lord.
Going to Babylon, even though they would have had to have been subservient, probably literally,
All their
would have
lives,
been
yeah.
protected by the infrastructure of Babylon already had in place.
Yeah, well, they could have had in Babylon what their kinfolks had who went with Ezekiel when they were carried away. In Ezekiel's deportation 11 years before, all these people were uprooted, hauled off to Babylon, and then effectively scattered along the Kibar River, the Kibar Canal. They were put there effectively as colonists. Yes, you've been deported from your land. Yes, you've been uprooted and dispossessed, but you're not in slavery. You can own your own house. You can own your own vineyard. You can get married. You can have a family. Yes, you have to be a loyal subject of the Babylonian government, but you have a relatively good amount of freedom. The one thing you're not allowed to do is go back to Judea. Well, you got to go to Judah to get there, but you can live there and have a good life. But these people, this last segment, completely blew that. Well, our time has passed. Our time is up. I apologize that we didn't quite get through this, but do go ahead and read through chapters 42 and 43. You'll see the plight of the remnant there, the folks that are still left. Like I said, they telegraphed their intention right here at the end of chapter 41. They're intending to go to Egypt. They're going to make a show of asking Jeremiah to ask the Lord, should we stay or should we go? And he's going to say, stay put. The Lord says, stay put. I'll take care of you. Trust me. And they're going to say, we don't trust him at all. We're going to Egypt. And off they go, and seemingly with Jeremiah in tow as a captive of his own people, basically. So we will stop there. I will send you by email the midterm, and just get that back to me in the next week or so, if you would. And just send me back a PDF of it, or however you want to do it. If that's inconvenient, just photograph it and send me the photographs. We'll work from there. Comments, questions?
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's.
The pulpit is now open for registration.
Yes, if you're interested in going to polishing the pulpit, registration is open. And if you're not interested in going to polishing the pulpit, you don't know what you're missing. We'll stop here. Yes, we'll stop here and pick up in chapter 44 next time. Let's have a word of prayer before we dismiss. Our Holy Father, we're grateful to you for your love, your long suffering, and your patience with us. We know, Father, that every gift and blessing that we enjoy in this life comes from you, and we thank you, Father, for your goodness. We ask that you help us to grow as the result of our studying from your word. We pray, Father, that we'll prosper in the faith and be accredited in your kingdom. We ask you to forgive us when we go astray, keep us from snares of the evil one. We thank you, Father, for your Son and for the offering that you've made so that we can be your children once more. Forgive us, Father, when we stray, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Time does
That
get
would
away.
be fun to see it done. Electronically,
We're doing it.
so you can see the different.